The sound came first, a thin, tearing noise against the frozen air. It was a sound of desperation, small and sharp, swallowed almost immediately by the opulent silence of the resort. Snow fell in perfect, cinematic flakes, each one landing softly on the heated cobblestones of the plaza, melting on contact. Christmas lights, tasteful and expensive, twinkled on manicured evergreens, casting a warm, golden glow that felt like a lie. It was Christmas night, a time for peace, for warmth, for family. But that sound, that tiny, wretched sound, was the antithesis of peace. Jack Ryder stopped, his breath misting in the frigid air. He had come here for the quiet. He had come here to escape the noise that lived permanently in his head, the echoes of places far from this gilded mountain retreat. For 3 days, it had almost worked. The silence of the snow-covered peaks, the hushed reverence of the wealthy guests, the absence of sirens and shouts. It had been a balm on a soul scorched by years of war. But the sound persisted, growing closer. It was a scraping, punctuated by a series of desperate, high-pitched yelps. Not the playful bark of a happy dog, but the cry of something small and terrified. He turned his head, his body already tensing, the old instincts rising from the deep, quiet place. He tried to keep them locked away. And then he saw them, 2 young men, no older than 20, dressed in designer ski jackets that cost more than his first car. Their faces were flushed with alcohol and arrogance, their laughter loud and brittle in the cold night. They were walking with a swagger, utterly confident in their dominion over this small, perfect world. And behind them, on taut leashes, were 3 German shepherd puppies. They couldn't have been more than 10 weeks old. Their paws, too soft for the icy ground, scrabbled for purchase. They were being dragged. Their small bodies skidded and tumbled across the abrasive stone, their bellies scraping against the frozen surface. One of them had given up. A limp bundle of fur pulled along like a sack of garbage. The other 2 still fought, their tiny legs churning, their whimpers cutting through Jack like shrapnel. The leashes were cinched tight around their necks, choking them with every step their careless masters took. The world seemed to narrow to that single, horrific image. The golden lights, the falling snow, the distant sound of a carol being played on a grand piano in the hotel lobby. It all faded into a gray, buzzing periphery. All that existed was the casual, smiling cruelty of the 2 men and the silent, screaming agony of the 3 small creatures at their heels. This was the moment the quiet ends, the moment the carefully constructed peace shatters into 1,000,000 pieces. What do you do when you see evil, small and petty, but evil nonetheless, performing on a brightly lit stage for an audience of none? Do you turn away? Do you tell yourself it's not your business? Or do you become the thing you came here to forget? For Jack Ryder, there was never a choice. Not really. The decision had been made for him long ago, etched into his DNA by training and tragedy, by fire and loss. He started walking toward them. The snow crunched under his boots, a sound as final and absolute as a chambered round. The quiet was over. A storm was coming. The invitation to the Blackwood Mountain Lodge had been a gesture of kindness from a man whose life Jack had saved 2 years prior. Marcus Thorne, a tech billionaire who'd found himself on the wrong side of a kidnapping plot in a foreign country, had offered Jack a permanent security detail, a blank check, a new life. Jack had refused it all, asking only for silence. But Marcus, persistent and genuinely grateful, had sent the Christmas invitation every year. "No strings, Jack," the note had read. "Just clean air and quiet. You've earned it." This year, Weighed down by a particularly brutal anniversary, Jack had finally accepted. He'd arrived with a single duffel bag and a heavy heart, hoping the mountain's profound stillness could absorb some of his own internal chaos. He was a man built for noise, for action, for the sharp, clarifying focus of a mission. Civilian life was a language he'd never quite learned to speak. Its rhythms were too slow, its dangers too subtle. Here, surrounded by people whose greatest concern was their dinner reservation, he felt like a wolf in a petting zoo, out of place, oversized, and harboring a capacity for violence that was both necessary and terrifying. The scars on his body told one story, a roadmap of close calls and paid debts. A jagged line along his forearm from a knife in a dusty marketplace, a puckered circle on his shoulder where a bullet had passed through. But the invisible scars were the ones that haunted him, the faces of his fallen brothers, the weight of impossible choices made in fractions of a second, the chilling memory of the void he'd looked into, and worse, the part of it that had looked back and found a home inside him. He spent his days hiking deep into the snow-covered wilderness, pushing his body to its physical limits, the burning in his lungs and the ache in his muscles a welcome distraction. He spoke to no one, made eye contact with no one. He was a ghost in a $1,000-a-night resort, and that was how he wanted it. He had sat by the massive stone fireplace in the main lodge earlier that evening, watching families in matching sweaters laugh and exchange gifts. He felt a profound, aching distance from it all, as if he were watching a movie about a species he didn't belong to. He saw the world through a different lens, a tactical overlay that assessed threats, calculated angles, and noted exits. He saw the softness in their lives, the unthinking security they took for granted, and he felt not envy, but a deep, weary sadness. He had sacrificed his own capacity for that kind of peace, to protect it for others. It was the soldier's paradox. He'd left the lodge not long after, needing the sharp, clean bite of the cold to clear his head. He had walked the perimeter of the resort, his hands shoved deep into the pockets of his plain black jacket, his gaze sweeping the landscape out of habit. He was watching the distant ridgeline, tracing the patterns of the ancient trees against the darkening sky, when the sound first reached him, a sound that did not belong in a world of softness and safety, a sound that pulled him from his solitude and thrust him back into the role he had been trying so desperately to shed, the role of the protector, the enforcer, the man who stands between the cruel and the helpless. He saw the lashes first, thin lines of expensive braided leather, glinting in the festive lights, then the puppies, their dark fur a stark contrast against the white snow that bordered the heated path, and then the men, their posture radiating an unearned and unexamined privilege that was more offensive to him than any overt threat. Their names were Braden and Kyle, though Jack did not know that yet. To him they were simply the enemy. They represented a casual disregard for life, a petty tyranny that he found more infuriating than the calculated violence of the battlefield. The soldiers he fought against often believed, however wrongly, in a cause. These boys believed in nothing but their own amusement, and their amusement was costing these small animals everything. The scraping sound grew louder as he closed the distance. It was the sound of their claws, their soft puppy pads, being ground away by the stone. He could see the dark smear one of them was leaving on the path, a wet trail of red against the gray. The puppy had gone limp, its eyes squeezed shut, enduring a pain it could not comprehend. The other two were still trying, whimpering with each pull, their necks bent at an unnatural angle. Braden, the taller of the two, laughed and gave a sharp tug on the leashes he held. "Come on, you little rats," he slurred, his voice thick with expensive scotch. "Daddy wants to get to the bar." Kyle chuckled, watching the struggling animals with a look of detached curiosity. "I think you broke that one," he said, gesturing with his chin at the limp puppy. "Told you we should have gotten a hardier breed, something with some grit." They were 100 feet away, then 50, then 20. Jack didn't run. He walked with a steady, deliberate pace. Every step was measured. He was a force of nature now, a glacier moving down the mountain, slow and unstoppable. The laughter of the two men died in their throats as they became aware of him. They saw a tall man in a simple black coat, his face shadowed by the night, walking directly into their path. They stopped, annoyance flickering across their features. To them, he was an obstacle, an interruption, a nobody. Jack came to a halt, 5 feet in front of them, positioning himself so they could not continue without walking through him. He didn't look at them. Not yet. His eyes were fixed on the puppies. He took in every detail, the raw, bleeding pads, the fear in their wide, dark eyes, the way their small bodies trembled uncontrollably, from cold and from terror. He could hear their frantic, shallow breathing. He let the silence stretch, a tactic he'd learned long ago. Silence makes people uncomfortable. It makes them reveal themselves. It was Braden who broke it. "Problem?" he asked, his tone dripping with condescension. He puffed out his chest, a reflexive display of dominance from someone who had never been in a real fight. Jack slowly lifted his gaze from the puppies and met Braden's eyes. Jack's own eyes were a pale, icy blue, and in that moment they held the flat, emotionless calm of a frozen lake. It was a gaze that had unnerved hardened warlords and terrorists. On a pampered boy like Braden, it had a visceral effect. The young man flinched, a flicker of uncertainty crossing his face, before being quickly replaced by bravado. "I asked you a question." Braden snapped, trying to reclaim his authority. "You're in our way." Jack's voice, when it came, was low and even, devoid of any discernible emotion. It was more terrifying than a shout. "Let them go." It wasn't a request. It was a command, delivered with an economy of words that gave it immense weight. Kyle snorted, a nervous, high-pitched sound. "Let them go? We just paid 10 grand for these mutts. They're ours." "They're animals," Jack said, his eyes still locked on Braden. "Not toys. You're hurting them." "Oh, I'm sorry," Braden said, his voice a mocking sneer. "Are we offending your delicate sensibilities? They're dogs. They'll be fine. Now move." He made to step around Jack. Jack didn't move a muscle. He simply stood there, an immovable object. His presence seemed to suck the air out of the space around them. The festive lights no longer seemed warm and cheerful, but harsh and interrogating. The falling snow felt colder. "I'm not going to ask again," Jack said, his voice dropping another octave, becoming a quiet rumble that vibrated in the air. For the first time, a genuine seed of fear took root in Braden's eyes. He had spent his life surrounded by people who were paid to agree with him, who were intimidated by his father's name, who bent to his will. He had never encountered a will stronger than his own. He was looking at one now. Braden, fueled by a potent cocktail of alcohol and ingrained arrogance, made a critical miscalculation. He mistook Jack's stillness for hesitation, his quiet tone for weakness. He was used to a world where the loudest voice won, where aggression was a substitute for strength. "You know what?" Braden said, taking a step closer, trying to use his height to intimidate. "I think you're the one with the problem." He shoved Jack hard in the chest. It was a sloppy, drunken push, but it was delivered with the full force of his frustration. He expected Jack to stumble back, to be knocked off balance. He expected a reaction of surprise, of fear. He got none of it. Jack didn't move, not an inch. It was like shoving a granite statue. The force of the push seemed to be absorbed into his frame, vanishing without a trace. All that happened was that the leashes in Braden's hand went slack for a moment, giving the two struggling puppies a brief, blessed respite from the choking pressure. Jack's eyes didn't even blink. His expression didn't change. But something in the air shifted, became heavier, colder. The ambient noise of the resort, the distant music, the faint chatter, seemed to fall away into a vacuum. There was only the sound of their breathing and the soft, steady fall of snow. Kyle saw it first. He saw the change in Jack's posture, a subtle coiling of energy, the tightening of muscles in his neck and shoulders. It was the look of a predator that had just been prodded with a stick, a moment of absolute stillness before the strike. Kyle's own bravado evaporated, replaced by a primal instinct to flee. "Bray," he said, his voice suddenly thin. "Bray, maybe we should just go." But Braden was too deep in his own ego. He saw Jack's lack of reaction as a challenge. "What's the matter, old man?" he taunted, his face turning red. "Cat got your tongue." He let the lashes drop completely, the three puppies collapsing into a trembling, whimpering heap on the cold stone. He balled his hands into fists. "You want to do this? You want to find out what happens when you mess with me?" Jack finally spoke again. His voice was just as quiet, just as calm, but now it held a razor's edge. "You have no idea what you're messing with." He took one slow, deliberate step forward. It was not an aggressive move, but an act of claiming ground, of altering the geometry of the confrontation. Braden, committed to his foolish course of action, swung a wild, looping punch aimed at Jack's head. It was the kind of punch you see in a bar fight, all power and no technique. Jack didn't even seem to move. There was a blur of motion, economical and precise. He swayed his head an inch to the right, the punch whistling past his ear. In the same fluid movement, his left hand came up and caught Braden's wrist. His fingers wrapped around the delicate bones with the unyielding pressure of a vice. Braden cried out, a sharp yelp of pain and surprise. His face went white. He tried to pull his arm back, but it was like trying to pull a steel rod out of concrete. "You have two options," Jack said, his voice a low whisper that was for Braden alone. His icy blue eyes bored into the terrified young man's. "Option 1, you walk away, you leave the dogs, you go back to your party, and you forget you ever saw me. Option 2, he paused, and his grip on Braden's wrist tightened infinitesimally, causing a fresh wave of agony to shoot up the young man's arm. "Is we continue this conversation, but I promise you, you will not like how it ends." The entire exchange had taken less than 5 seconds. To the few people who were beginning to notice the altercation from the lodge windows or the pathways, it was a confusing, indistinct scene. They saw 2 young men and a third, older man standing close together. They couldn't hear the words. They couldn't feel the crushing pressure on Braden's wrist. They couldn't see the terror blooming in his eyes. All they saw was a confrontation they didn't understand, and like most people, their first instinct was to observe, not to intervene. They thought he was just some guy, some tourist who had a problem with a couple of rich kids. They were wrong. They were watching a surgeon at work, and he was just beginning to make his incision. Braden, his face contorted in a mask of pain and humiliation, tried to speak, but only a choked gasp came out. His entire universe had been upended in a single, silent moment. The foundational belief that his wealth and status made him untouchable had been shattered. He was being held, effortlessly, by a man whose name he didn't know. A man who looked at him not with anger, but with a chilling, profound disappointment. Kyle, seeing his friend so easily and completely neutralized, took a stumbling step back. He held his hands up in a gesture of surrender. "Hey, man, we don't want any trouble. Seriously, we were just having some fun." Jack didn't even glance at him. His focus remained entirely on Braden. "Fun?" Jack repeated the word, his voice laced with a dark, cold irony. He tilted his head slightly, and for the first time, his face was fully illuminated by the golden glow of a nearby lamp-post. The light caught the faint silvery trace of a scar that ran from his left temple down to his jawline. It was an old wound, but it gave his otherwise handsome features a dangerous, predatory edge. "This is your idea of fun?" He finally released Braden's wrist, shoving him back a step. Braden cradled his arm, his eyes wide with a mixture of fear and fury. The confrontation had now drawn more attention. A small crowd of onlookers had begun to gather at a safe distance. Hotel guests in expensive winter wear, staff members in crisp uniforms. They stood in silence, their faces pale and curious in the falling snow, illuminated like actors on a stage. No one moved to help. No one spoke. They were an audience to a drama they were too timid to join. Seeing the crowd, Braden's bravado made a desperate return. He saw an opportunity to reframe the narrative, to paint himself as the victim. "What the hell is wrong with you?" he shouted, his voice cracking. "You just assaulted me. This man just attacked me." He pointed a trembling finger at Jack, playing to the gallery of silent observers. "Somebody call security. He's crazy." Kyle, seeing his friend's tactic, quickly joined in. "Yeah, he came out of nowhere. We were just walking our dogs, and he just attacked us." The word dogs hung in the air, a grotesque mischaracterization of the scene that had unfolded. The three puppies were still huddled together on the ground, one of them occasionally letting out a pained whimper. Their plight was the heart of the matter, yet the two young men were trying to erase them from the story. The crowd murmured. They looked from the well-dressed, frantic young men to the silent, imposing figure of Jack. They saw what they were conditioned to see: wealth versus a stranger, hysteria versus a disquieting calm. Their sympathies were uncertain, wavering. Jack ignored the accusations. He ignored the growing crowd. He knelt down, moving with a surprising grace. He gently reached out a hand, not to the puppies, but to the ground beside them, letting them see it, letting them smell him. He made no sudden moves. He said nothing. He simply offered them a moment of stillness, a promise of non-threat. One of the puppies, the one who had been fighting the hardest, hesitantly lifted its head. It looked at Jack's outstretched hand, then up at his face. Its tail gave a single, tentative thump against the cold stone. Jack kept his movements slow and deliberate. He unclipped the leash from the puppy's collar, then the second, then the third, the one that had been dragged limp. He carefully gathered the small, trembling creature into his arms, tucking it inside his coat against the warmth of his body. He could feel its heart hammering against his ribs, a frantic, terrified rhythm. He then stood up, the tiny puppy secure in his arms, and faced the two accusers and their silent audience. He held the puppy up slightly, for all to see. "This is what you were walking," he said, his voice now carrying across the plaza, clear and steady. It was not a shout, but it commanded the attention of every single person present. He ran a hand gently over the puppy's fur and then showed his palm to the crowd. It was smeared with blood. "They were bleeding," he said, his voice flat. "Their paws are raw. You were dragging them. I saw you. I heard them crying." The directness of the statement, the simple, undeniable evidence of the blood on his hand, sent a ripple of shock through the onlookers. Their gazes shifted from Jack to Braden and Kyle, and now their expressions held not just curiosity, but dawning comprehension. The moral lines of the conflict were beginning to sharpen. Braden's face, already flushed, turned a deeper shade of crimson. He was being exposed, his cruelty laid bare for everyone to see, and he couldn't stand it. The carefully constructed image of the charming, powerful young man was crumbling. "He's lying," he sputtered, his voice becoming shrill. "They were running. They were playing. He's just some psycho who has a problem with people who have money." It was a desperate, pathetic defense, and it rang false in the cold night air. The crowd was no longer a neutral body. Whispers started to spread. Looks of disgust were exchanged. The silent judgment was turning against the two young men. Jack didn't need to raise his voice or defend himself. He had the truth on his side, and it was a more powerful weapon than any fist or shouted insult. He took a step toward Braden, the puppy still held securely in his arms. Braden flinched and took a step back, a reflexive action that betrayed his guilt to everyone watching. "You think money is a shield," Jack said, his voice low and intense, each word carefully chosen, each one a hammer blow against Braden's fragile ego. "You think it buys you the right to be cruel, to take a life, even one this small, and treat it as a disposable toy for your own amusement." He looked from Braden to Kyle, then his gaze swept across the faces in the crowd. He was speaking to all of them now. "Look at this animal," he commanded, his voice resonating with a profound moral authority. "He can't speak. He can't tell you that his feet are bleeding, that he's freezing, that he's terrified. He depends on us, on our capacity for kindness, for decency." He paused, letting the weight of his words settle. The silence in the plaza was absolute. Even the snow seemed to fall more quietly. "I've been in places," Jack continued, his voice dropping, becoming more personal, more raw, "where cruelty is a currency, where life is cheap. I've seen what men are capable of when they believe they have power over the powerless. It's the ugliest thing in the world. I didn't expect to find it here, on Christmas night, in a place like this." He looked directly at Braden again, and the contempt in his eyes was a physical force. "What you did here tonight, it's not just about a dog. It's about character. It's about a rot that starts small, a casual cruelty to an animal today. What about tomorrow? A disregard for a person you see as beneath you. The powerful have a greater responsibility to be kind, not a greater license to be cruel. You failed that test. You failed it miserably." His words were a verdict, a judgment delivered not by a court of law, but by a higher court of human decency. There was no defense against it. Braden opened his mouth to retort, but no words came. He was stripped bare, his arrogance and his wealth rendered meaningless. He was just a petty, cruel boy, and now everyone knew it. The other two puppies, sensing a shift in the energy, had crawled over to Jack's feet. They huddled against his legs, seeking protection from the man who had become their unlikely savior. The image was devastatingly powerful, the strong, silent man, shielding the three small wounded creatures from their tormentors. It was a perfect, cinematic tableau of good versus evil, and no one watching could mistake which side was which. The spell was finally broken. A woman in the crowd, her face etched with a mixture of shame and resolve, pulled out her phone. The bright screen illuminated her determined expression. "I'm calling the police," she announced, her voice clear and strong, cutting through the tense silence. "And hotel security. What you did to these animals is a crime." Her action was a spark. Others in the crowd found their voices. "She's right," a man in a ski hat said, his voice filled with anger. "That's animal abuse." Another person started recording with their phone, the small red light a new, unblinking witness. The power had shifted completely. Braden and Kyle were no longer the confident masters of their universe. They were the accused, tried and convicted in the court of public opinion. The crowd, once passive bystanders, had become a jury, and their verdict was unanimous. Kyle, the weaker of the two, began to crumble. "This is a misunderstanding," he stammered, looking around at the hostile faces. "Braden, let's just go. Give him the dogs. Let's just go." But Braden was trapped between the humiliation of retreat and the certainty of further consequence. His father's name, the ultimate trump card he had played his entire life, was useless here. In fact, it would only make the story more delicious for the press. "Son of billionaire tycoon caught torturing puppies on Christmas." He could see the headlines. He could feel his world shrinking. Security guards from the lodge arrived first. Two burly men in formal uniforms. Their faces were grim. They had likely been alerted by staff members who had witnessed the event unfold from the windows. "What's going on here?" the head guard asked, his eyes taking in the scene. Jack holding the puppy, the other two at his feet, Braden and Kyle standing apart, and the circle of angry guests. Before Braden could launch into his fabricated story, the woman with the phone stepped forward. "These two men," she said, pointing a finger that did not tremble, "were dragging these puppies across the pavement. This man," she gestured to Jack, "stepped in to stop them." The guard looked at Jack, at the blood on his hand, at the puppy nestled in his coat. He then looked at the raw, scraped paws of the puppies on the ground. His professional neutrality hardened into disgust. He knew who Jack was, not by name, but Marcus Thorne had personally informed the head of security that a special guest, a war hero, would be staying with them and was to be afforded absolute privacy and respect. Thorne had called him a man of unimpeachable character. The guard looked at Braden, whose father owned a minority stake in the hotel chain, and made a decision. "Mr. Jennings," the guard said, his voice firm and official, addressing Braden by name, "you and your friend need to come with us." "You can't be serious," Braden snarled, his last vestiges of control slipping away. "Do you know who my father is? He'll have your job." The threat, once so potent, now sounded like the pathetic whining of a child. The guard didn't even blink. "I'm sure he will be very interested to hear about this incident. Now please, come with us. The police are on their way, and we can sort this out in my office." The second guard moved to flank them, his posture leaving no room for argument. Defeated, Braden and Kyle were escorted away, a parade of two walking away from the scene of their own moral wreckage. The crowd watched them go, their silence now heavy with contempt. As they passed, Jack looked down at the two puppies at his feet. He knelt again and gathered them up, holding all three of them now. They were so light, their bodies so fragile. They licked at his chin, their tiny tails starting to wag, their trust in humanity already, miraculously, beginning to mend. The woman who had called the police approached him. "Is there anything I can do?" she asked, her eyes full of concern for the animals. "They need a vet," Jack said, his voice softer now, "and a warm place." "The hotel has a vet on call," the head guard said, returning to Jack's side. "We'll take care of everything. Mr. Thorne would insist on it." Jack nodded, a silent expression of gratitude. The crowd began to disperse. The drama concluded. They would talk about it for days, the story of the quiet man who stood up to the rich bullies. It would become a small legend at the Blackwood Mountain Lodge. Jack was left standing in the snow, the 3 small lives in his arms. He had come here seeking peace, and had instead found a war, albeit a small one. But as he looked down at the puppies, who were now squirming, trying to lick his face, he felt a flicker of something he hadn't felt in a long, long time. Not peace, exactly, but purpose. And for a man like Jack Ryder, that was almost the same thing. A warm room was provided, complete with soft blankets and bowls of water and food. The on-call veterinarian, a kind-faced woman named Dr. Evans, arrived within the hour. She worked with quiet efficiency, her hands gentle as she cleaned the puppies' scraped paws and bellies, applying soothing salves and bandages. Jack sat in a chair in the corner of the room, watching her, saying nothing. The 3 puppies, whom he'd unofficially named Alpha, Bravo, and Charlie, seemed to understand they were finally safe. After their initial ravenous consumption of food and water, they had crawled onto a pile of blankets and fallen into a deep, twitching sleep, piled on top of one another for warmth and comfort. Dr. Evans finished her work and packed her bag. "They'll be sore for a few days," she said softly, turning to Jack. "But there's no permanent damage. You got to them in time." She paused, looking at him with an expression of deep respect. "What you did? Thank you." Jack just nodded, his eyes still on the sleeping puppies. The words felt unnecessary. The action was what mattered. The outcome was what mattered. After the vet left, Marcus Thorne called. Jack's phone, a simple, non-smart flip phone, buzzed on the nightstand. He rarely answered it, but he recognized the number. "Jack." Marcus's voice was tense. "My head of security just filled me in. Are you all right?" "I'm fine," Jack said. "Good, because the Jennings family is not. I just got off the phone with Braden's father. He was explosive, made a lot of threats." "I'm not surprised," Jack said, his tone flat. "He's pulling every string he has. He's trying to get the local DA to press assault charges against you. He's claiming you were the aggressor, that you attacked his son without provocation." Jack was silent for a moment, watching the steady rise and fall of the puppies' chests as they slept. There were witnesses. "I know," Marcus said, "and my people are getting statements. The hotel security footage is crystal clear. Legally, you're in the clear. I'll make sure of it. But Jack, this guy is powerful, and he's vindictive. His son was humiliated, and he's the kind of man who doesn't let that go. He won't come at you directly, not through the law. It'll be something else, something quieter." Jack understood. He had seen it 100 times before. The powerful don't always need the law. They have other tools, money, influence, people who owe them favors. "Tell me what you need," Marcus said, his voice firm. "I have your back, 100%. I owe you my life. I'm not going to let some spoiled brat's father ruin yours." "I don't need anything," Jack said. "Just make sure the dogs are taken care of. Find them a good home." There was a pause on the other end of the line. "A good home?" Marcus said. "Jack, from what I hear, it looks like they've already found one." Jack looked at the 3 sleeping bundles of fur. A home. The concept was foreign to him. He lived in a sterile apartment between deployments. He had no pets, no plants, nothing that required him to be responsible for it, nothing that could be used as leverage against him. He was a ghost, and ghosts don't have homes. They just have hiding places. "I'm not the right guy for that," he said, his voice quiet. "Yes, you are, Jack," Marcus replied gently. "You might be the only guy for that." Before Jack could argue, the door to the room opened. It was the head of security. He looked apologetic. "Sir, I'm sorry to disturb you, but Mr. Jennings and his son are leaving the property. They're walking through the lobby now." Jack stood up. He didn't know why, but he felt a need to see them one last time, to close the loop. He walked out of the room and down the hall to a balcony that overlooked the grand vaulted lobby of the lodge. Below, he saw Braden and his father, a severe-looking man in a tailored suit, storming toward the main entrance, flanked by hotel management. Braden's arm was in a sling, a theatrical touch that screamed of a frivolous lawsuit to come. He looked sullen and angry. As they reached the massive oak doors, Braden stopped. He seemed to feel Jack's eyes on him. He looked up, his gaze sweeping the balconies until it found him. Their eyes met across the vast, opulent space. Braden's face, which had been a mask of petulant rage, transformed. A slow, cold smile spread across his lips. It was a smile of pure malice, a promise of future retribution. He couldn't win with his fists, and he couldn't win with the truth. But his expression made it clear that he intended to win in the end. He mouthed 2 words at Jack, a silent threat that carried all the way up to the balcony. "You're dead." Then he turned and walked out into the night, swallowed by the darkness. The storm had passed, but the air was not clear. A new, colder front was moving in. Jack stood on the balcony for a long time, the threat echoing in the silence. He had faced down armies and assassins. He had walked through fire and survived. But the enemy he had just made was a different kind of monster, one that wore a suit and fought its battles in boardrooms and back alleys. He turned and walked back to the room. He closed the door behind him and locked it. The 3 puppies were still sleeping, oblivious to the new danger their rescuer had brought upon himself. He sat down in the chair and watched them, the 3 small, innocent lives he was now responsible for. Marcus was right. They were his now, and if the Jennings family wanted to come after him, they would have to come through him. He was no longer just a man seeking quiet. He was a guardian. He had a mission. Let them come. He would be ready.